All right. So welcome to January's information session titled Tribal Emergency Management, Preparing Remote and Geographically Isolated Communities. This webinar is being hosted by the Alaska Tribal Resilience Learning Network under the Alaska Climate Adaptation Science Center in partnership with the Native American Fish and Wildlife Society. My name is Lori Petrowski. I'm one of the climate resilience liaisons with the Alaska CASC and the Native American Fish and Wildlife Society, and I live in Fairbanks. As with most of our sessions, this session is being recorded to post on our website. So before we start, let's do some quick Zoom reminders. If you're calling in, please mute your phone. If you don't have a dedicated mute button, pressing *6 should mute your phone. If you're using computer audio, all participants have been muted. So during the question and answer session, you'll be able to unmute yourself to ask a question. And you can also enter your questions into the chat and we will read your questions out loud. And we invite those of you who are able to access the chat on Zoom to introduce yourself and tell us where you're from. Oops, sorry. There we go. Just the first slide. So we acknowledge that everywhere we live and work is Indigenous lands, and our team is located all across the state. One of our offices is located on the traditional homelands of the Lower Tanana Dene people in interior Alaska. Our offices are physically located on Trothyeta, meaning Indian Potato Ridge, campus at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Traditional Chief Peter John from Minto shared the story of this ridge in the 1990s, and the official name was changed in 2013. And we also have team members located in Shaktoolik and Anchorage. So we often work as a team together. And so here's a quick picture of a lot of the folks that we work with to provide support as part of this Tribal Resilience Learning Network. And the intent of the Learning Network is to create a community of learning, sharing, technical assistance, training, and support for Alaska tribes and Indigenous communities as they respond to and adapt to the changing and current future impacts of climate change. There are several different ways that you can participate in the Learning Network in addition to participating in these information sessions. So these include signing up for individual community check-ins, signing up for the monthly e-bulletin, our newsletter, and attending any of our trainings. And you can visit our website listed here on the slide. And so now, without further ado, I would like to welcome Stephanie Nelson and John Pennington. So I will stop sharing and you can take it away, John.
Okay, everyone, let's see. Good morning. First and foremost, can everyone hear me okay? Okay, fantastic. All right, so we're going to share, and then we should be good to go. So let me do the screen share check first. Lori, can you see the first slide of the presentation?
I can, but I'm seeing I think the presenter view.
Okay, hang on. Is that better now?
Same thing.
Okay, hang on.
There we go.
And are you seeing the presenter view or the full view now?
We could see
Full
the
view.
full.
Say that again.
Full view. Looks good.
Okay, good. All right. With that, welcome everyone. Stephanie, you want to kick us off?
Thank you. Thank you, Lori and your team for having us here today. Again, my name is Stephanie Nelson. I'm the Director of Emergency Management for the Inupiat Community of the Arctic Slope. And we'll go ahead and dive into this session. John, go ahead. John, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I'm having some tech issues right on time. My name is John Pennington, and I serve two roles. I am an assistant professor and deputy director here at UAF for the Center of Arctic Security and Resilience, and I am the Homeland Security and Emergency Management Advisor for the Inupiat Community of the Arctic Slope. And together, Stephanie and I have worked together now for right at 5 years in building this emergency management department that we're going to share with you today.
Thank you for that. And I'll go one more back. And I wanted to share our team. We have,
Oh.
we're going to dive into it a little more, but we have our village coordinators, Robert, Christina, and Caroline with our emergency management team.
Okay, our agenda, we're going to go into the background and history of ICAS. We're going to talk about the creation and development and activation of our DEM structure. We're going to talk about the operating environment that we are in currently in the Arctic. We're really going to dissect for a minute or two why words matter, specific words such as what is a disaster, specifically in the cultural context. We're going to look at the four phases of emergency management for our specific department, including preparedness, training and exercise, response and response coordination, recovery from disaster, and that transition, which includes a sovereign option that is not too often exercised, but what should be in the future here in Alaska. We'll talk about how we mitigate future disasters and the processes of that. And then we're going to have a heavier focus on alert and warning, and then kind of talk about the path forward and then open it up to Q&A.
And just to provide some background and history, Inupiat Community of the Arctic Slope, ICAS, is a federally recognized regional Alaska Native tribe governed by the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. And through ICAS's constitution, as amended, it represents and is elected by the Inupiat people of our region. And ICAS was established as an IRA on August 26 of 1971. And you could see our region with our 8 communities from Point Hope all the way to Koktovik. And ICAS has been dormant for a few years, couple years back before we got started. And we've expanded our services, and one of them being the Department of Emergency Management. And our regional headquarters is based out of Utqiagvik in Barrow. Next one, John. Some background in regards to ICAS's Department of Emergency Management was formally presented to our tribal citizens during our annual membership in 2023 and was formally adopted through our tribal council, through our tribal code, the title of Title 18 Emergency Management. So some history of how we got started. In 2020, ICAS applied for a funding through the Center of Disease Control and Prevention, and that was to establish the emergency operation centers in our communities with the objective to enhance situational awareness during COVID response. And through that program, with that grant, we were able to establish and codify the Department of Emergency Management. And our department's vision is a regional tribal emergency management system that protects the health, safety, and the Inupiat way of life through our region. And our mission is to enhance situational awareness and provide timely alerts and warnings to the communities, establish strategies to mitigate hazards, prepare for and effectively coordinate response and recovery to emergencies and disasters across our region. And a note we're going to go over through this presentation is the response versus response coordination and the role emergency management plays in that. And in this photo right here is our former president of the council, George Edwardson, signing our emergency management department resolution. Next one, John. So to provide some context of our ICAS's DEM's operating environment, our region, our surface area spans 97,000 square miles across Alaska's Arctic. We are a regional ICAS Emergency Operations Center that's based in Utqiagvik, formerly known as Barrow, and where we have our satellite emergency operations centers in our villages of Point Hope, Point Lay, and in Unuktuvic Pass. And through our region, we do have 8 federally recognized Inupiat tribes and their communities. So that's like the native village of Point Hope, native village of Point Lay, village of Wainwright, Nuragamute Tribal Council of Unuktuvic Pass, native village of Utkasuk, native village of Barrow, native village of Koktovik. And our environment, we go from severe weather, being isolated communities where we only have everything kind of flowing in, but open access to the community winter access trails during the winter time periods, which will be opening up here shortly with a short duration of getting things in and out. And then what we're going through with fuel. And John, do you want to kind of touch on the
Sure.
geographic isolated?
Absolutely. We wanted to highlight these two really bold and areas at the bottom, remote and geographically isolated. And it's that emergency management frameworks in the United States and largely in Alaska still tend to have been designed for urban and rural areas. They have the assets, the resources, the population, the structures to be able to support what is traditionally known as emergency management in the United States. Most of the doctrine in the US has been built that way. But what we want to stress about Alaska and how we have to, the challenges that we faced, and we certainly experienced it through Typhoon Merbok and then Halong, is that we have remote communities, of course, but in many ways, remote communities are defined as those that are still attached to road systems, largely isolated but accessible. But all of our communities are, with the exception of Barrow, essentially, which has a large airport and a TSA function, our communities are geographically isolated. It's a phrase that we want to get adopted by FEMA and others to really stress the visual that time and response is not measured in hours or days. Sometimes it's response that's thrown through weeks. So we stress that new phrase of geographically isolated communities that represent a lot of the Alaska rural and Arctic and Alaska Native communities that we work within.
Thank you for that. And then the next one.
So words matter, and this is again something that we like to stress, and not just in the building of our department, but when we've gone to the villages and worked with our partners there, as well as the individuals that we work with in emergency management there and across the state, we like to really throw out the question of what is an incident, what is an emergency, a crisis, or crises and disasters. So we like to clarify that in most of the presentations that we give is we look at an incident as a kind of a one-off that law enforcement responds singularly to a particular event, or a nurse will respond to an incident, or fire responds to an incident. An emergency, we like to say, is the evolution of that, where it starts including more than one entity or function. Police has to support law enforcement, or law enforcement has to support police. Emergency management might be contacted. Crisis is what we often refer to as all of those elements, but there becomes a real serious monetary impact to a community or to a function. And a good example of that would have been the COVID event in the United States in 2020 on, which impacted hospitals and their revenue. They couldn't do routine operations or surgeries or even appointments. So it impacted the fiscal aspect. And then the disaster. And disasters have been statutorily defined in the United States as generally those things that impact the social and cultural fabric of a community. But if you really dive into a lot of our communities, what we find is that floods, fires, earthquakes, windstorms, those things that are enumerated in the Stafford Act, which guides all disasters in the United States at the federal level, kind of pushed downward, that those definitions don't necessarily apply to tribal communities in Alaska. They do, but as the example we like to share often is that if the Bowhead Well doesn't come around Point Hope and work its way in spring towards the Western Canadian Arctic Ocean, then there isn't the ability for whaling and subsistence and tradition and festivals. That is, by all accounts, a disaster in those communities. Similarly, with salmon, we see that if salmon populations don't just return, but a certain species of salmon doesn't return, that too can be defined as a disaster. So it's more culturally dependent. And then that phrase that you see below is really how we like to get out and preach about what disasters are. They're essentially statutorily defined, but they're culturally experienced. And we want each community to define what a disaster is in this case. All right. We're going to go through 4 traditional phases. There are the way that the federal government has structured this now, there's actually 5 mission areas, but the older, more traditional phases of what emergency management are largely applicable to how we operate in Alaska, and certainly with ICAS-DEM. And we're going to go through each of them, and you can see that it's a continuous cycle. And a good example of this before we go into each one of these and how they have connected to us in building this department and the function across the slope is that you're always in one of these, and no matter where you are in one of these, inevitably you'll be dragged into another part of it. So we were obviously responding and recovering from Typhoon Merbok, and mitigating from that and preparing for other events when Typhoon Halong hit. So we've got 2 of those cycles going for those communities as an example. All right, Steph?
Now, kind of providing some information on the aspect of the preparedness training and exercise that we have done and building up from program to our department. Um, introduction, emergency management introduction sessions within our communities, why emergency management matters, and we've heard different aspects of emergency management or risk. And so that was our way of providing what we're doing, how we can help, introductions within our community and with the community leaders, and kind of going into that incident command system, providing an overviews and getting our citizens signed up for FEMA student identification numbers, and going through those FEMA online independent study courses of 100 and 200. And then we were able to have our village coordinators come up to Barrow to kind of get an overview training of our emergency management, our function within our regional EOC, and how we will communicate with one another when something does happen. And they're able to ask questions in person, and we're able to kind of walk through a scenario in their community. And we have our emergency alert and warning testings in our local villages. So we've gone in the last 5 years, gone to all 8 of I'm based in Barrow, and we've traveled to all of our 7 outlining communities, and especially here in Barrow, being able to put together a leadership internal group and sending out a test message, and so that they're able to see firsthand what that emergency alert and warning looks like when we reach out to the leadership group. And then the next one is the comprehensive emergency management plan, and that one is our basic plan of laying out the foundation of how we're responding and how we're communicating with our local and regional stakeholders. And then that ties into our communities with their small community emergency response plans with our CEMP that we're working on with our villages. And then lastly, to highlight our integrated emergency management course. That is something that we were able to get awarded by FEMA. And we were able to have FEMA come up to our region here in Barrow and host a 4-day training and exercise. And that was the first of FEMA to come in a positive note, in a planning and exercise format to be able to dive into trainings and two scenarios that we picked. And we were able to have participation from all of our 8 villages, in person and virtual, regional and local stakeholders to participate in that. And that was a huge success. And so, John, I'll turn it over to you for the next one.
Yep. So we're going to move then from that preparedness phase over to the response phase. There we go. So when we are fortunate enough to see foreseeable events, we really kick into response and response coordination. And one of the things that we immediately talk about once we get into, or we clarify once we get into our communities, and as we built the construct of the department, is response is very tactical, and communities are already doing it every day. Fire does what fire does. Law enforcement does what law enforcement does. Public works, which is huge in any community across the slope or that does that function of public works, is they're very tactical first responders in their own way. But what emergency management is, we share is it is the coordination of that. There's not a lot of command. There's not any control really. It's about coordination, collaboration, and communications. So the things that we routinely do and have done now dozens of times, we facilitate briefings in coordination with the National Weather Service when it comes to response planning with those potentially impacted communities. So it can be Kaktovik with a winter storm that has 75-mile-per-hour winds. Point Hope on the other spectrum, on the other side of the Arctic, which had the potential, along with Point Ley and Wainwright, to be impacted by Typhoon Halong coming in. We had twice daily meetings for about a week period as that came into focus more for us. So we facilitate those briefings. We begin coordination with our partners at the North Slope Borough's Emergency Management and Risk Department, their Public Works Department, and their senior leadership. And I think that this is one of the areas where ICAS has been really extremely successful. We have more or less defined our specific roles in response and response coordination, but that partnership with the North Slope Borough having lots of assets and resources, instead of running parallel tracks during response or response coordination, we're all pretty unified during major events, whether they're foreseeable or we're having to respond on short notice. Very obviously, we activate the ICAS Emergency Operations Center. It is the nerve center, both virtually and in person, when things are happening across the slope. We like to remind people that all of our communities are not connected by road, but we have connected them absolutely through emergency management. And at times that's through satellite communications, it's through alert and warning, but we activate that EOC to pull all of those pieces together. And again, it's not to command or control anything, as an example in Point Hope or Kaktovik, but it is to support what their needs are, their requests are, to offer suggestions and guide towards recovery, etc. After we operate or activate the EOC, we go right into prioritization of community lifelines. That is a FEMA doctrine that we'll really subscribe to. It's the initial snapshot of what's happening in a community. There are 8 of those lifelines that we tend to look at. So we ask for situation reports that come in from our communities that give us a snapshot of what those lifelines, basic lifelines are. It's all about village and first responder support. And then eventually our EOC during this response and response coordination phase, at the end of each day, sometimes twice a day, depending on the urgency of the situation, we'll develop situation reports, or you'll hear the phrase sit reps, and we will send those to our partners in either the borough, other parts of the state, but very definitely to the state and to FEMA Region 10, which has a very government-to-government direct relationship with ICAS. And then we continue the alert and warning process, and we're going to focus on that in a little bit and how it really has been a tool for us in a way that we didn't expect. But then part of what we also do in the response and response coordination phase is look at public information coordination and briefing of senior elected officials, making sure there are no surprises along the way. So tribal elders or tribal community leaders, president, councils, all the way up to ICAS leadership, and then merge that with the North Slope Borough's leadership as well. Right. Then after that response generally begins to end, we start transitioning to recovery. Now, we don't say just flat out recovery. There is a slower, methodical pace by which we transition toward that recovery. Response is fast, it's high anxiety, high pressure at times. But the process of a recovering a community, which is a completely different pace that involves serious decisions of everything from let's just say, do we build in that area again? What do we do about the destroyed homes? It's just a different pace. So we like to transition our community into recovery. We will conduct local initial damage assessments. We've trained and are training up to that point where our communities know how to do something called windshield surveys, but also fill out a basic document of here are the homes, here's how they look, here are the immediate damages that we can see. Doesn't have to be perfect. Again, just a snapshot. Then we will largely coordinate an ICAS-wide assessment and documentation gathering. That has to be done in conjunction with the North Slope Borough and then all of our communities. And everywhere that we have a community, with the exception of Point Lay, a tribal council, we also have a city that mirrors. So we're gathering documents largely from borough, ICAS, the impacted native tribe, and then the city that corresponds with it, again, with the exception of Point Lay. We coordinate the policy meetings. Once we start moving into recovery, and policymakers, the elected officials have to be brought into that process, guiding them, not by any stretch, dictating anything, but strongly suggesting areas, guiding them in areas of response and recovery. And then that second to the last check mark, the really critical part about emergency management now in Alaska as it continues to grow and sovereignty is becoming more relevant with a big capital giant S in emergency management, is which route do we go on a disaster declaration with FEMA if we decide to go that route and we need to. And for Alaska, we have two really credible, solid options that exist in policy. The first one is that we work through the state. And up north, we have a borough, so we could work with the borough, and then they in turn would request a disaster declaration from the state of Alaska, and then the state of Alaska would go up to FEMA Region 10 and to FEMA's processes. But if, as an example, the borough is not overwhelmed or the damages don't add up and we want to look at a more unique option, we have that tool in our toolkit, which is the government-to-government sovereign option that was initially created in 2013 with the Sandy Recovery Improvement Act. And we've utilized that once very directly with FEMA and then in an appeals process for the fiber outage of 2023, the undersea cable fiber outage. And then again, as recently as with Typhoon Halong, where we worked with our communities to consider that government-to-government option versus going through the borough. Good discussions with the borough in the lockstep borough with us the whole time, so it's a good partnership. And then when we have these disasters that do impact us, developing an initial recovery plan for that particular impacted community.
And lastly, in this phase is the mitigating future disasters. And what we've done in the last 5 years was a huge one with our project with the North Slope Borough, was developing a region-wide multi-jurisdictional hazard mitigation plan. And through that process, we had an MOU in participation with our local authorities throughout our region. And as John mentioned, that includes the North Slope Borough, the 7 cities, and the 9 federally recognized tribes. And through that process, I think it was extensively around 2 years, getting it to the point of getting it adopted, FEMA adopted and state adopted, and as well as getting our local authorities to adopt the hazard mitigation plan. And through that process, we're able to seek targeted mitigation funding for high-risk mitigation projects in our communities. And I know that the funding source right now through FEMA, but this process of having that hazard mitigation project, we're able to have a central location and having those discussions with our communities as we move forward. And through the outreach and education in regards to the mitigation plan and any potential projects that we want to that they have prioritized. So when there's funding available, we're able to further initiate those efforts. And that goes with the long-term planning, including planned migration, retreat, shelter in place, and coordinating community visions and priorities.
One thing I want to highlight on this, a lesson learned as we work our way through this process of this presentation, that top one on developing the regional-wide multi-jurisdictional hazard mitigation plans. Stephanie touched on, and very appropriately, that process. What we have learned, and I think one of the challenges we will face in Alaska, in fact, we saw that with the previous plans that existed and didn't exist across the slope. The process really is that you try to build as much of consensus as you can in each community about what your hazards and risks and threats are, and the larger kind of mitigation process. You pull that together, and then the state has to adopt it. They basically or approve it. They work back and forth with you to make sure it meets certain criteria. Then FEMA Region 10 needs to approve it. Now, it was a pretty big day when we got the approval of that, but that's not the end of the process. For ICAS, we had to then go back to each one of those jurisdictions, all of them that participated, and they have to adopt it at the council level, tribal, city, borough, ICAS. It has to be adopted or it's not in effect. So I want to make sure we close that loop and make sure that everyone knows if you go down this route for the future, assuming that these plans are still in place with whatever the new FEMA is, that you circle back and make sure that your individual communities do adopt them to make sure they're truly in play. Okay, so we want to focus on towards the end of this presentation, something that has really been a game changer that we did not see. And that was our alert and warning function, our protocols, how it exemplifies sovereignty in action in Alaska and really across the nation for ICAS and ICAS-DEM. And it really circles around to what the Integrated Public Alert and Warning System is. It is essentially FEMA's in charge of coordinating and running programs that support the National System for Wireless Emergency Alerts, the Emergency Alert System, essentially everything that can ping your community or you as an individual when bad things happen. Now, the key to this here is that in the state of Alaska, there are these communities that you see listed, and ICAS is the only tribe in Alaska with that alerting authority. And we very purposefully set out to request that authority. And if you're not able to see the slide very well, you'll see that it includes Juneau, University of Alaska Fairbanks, City of Valdez, the Muni, of course, in Anchorage, Kodiak Police Department. But we are currently the only tribal government that has the authority to do this. What you'll also see not included here is the North Slope Borough does not have that authority to reach across the entire Arctic slope for the purposes of emergency alert and notifications. Now, there are programs, but the FEMA approved one is the equivalent of essentially interrupting TV, radio, anything that's out there for the purposes of emergency alerting. And these are the entities. Why did we seek that authority and how has it made a difference is what we want to briefly touch on. We approached FEMA in 2022 and said, we have some philosophical differences with the state on when and how IPAWS should be used. A more conservative approach, I would say, from the state. And we wanted something a little different, something that looked at the Arctic as very unique, the cultural aspects of alerting and notifying, more frequent alerts to protect life safety, because those geographically isolated communities, often in the Arctic winter context, life safety issues are not that kind of a time frame. They're this close. So alerting and warning the community sooner than later, and what matters and what doesn't matter should be in the eye of the beholder again, which is ICAS and our communities. And FEMA was gracious and said absolutely, and authorized us to do that. Stephanie and I went through the training and have been alerting the communities under IPAWS since then. It's a good exercise in tribal sovereignty. The other part is that it's a direct government-to-government relationship with FEMA, as opposed to having, as an example, the state or frankly anyone in between us and the federal government, as we'll kind of call it part of that quasi-trust responsibility. We have the ability to alert our own communities when either we see things happening, we see that they may happen, or even after an event has occurred. And it really does ensure tribal control over the messaging to our tribal citizens and to the greater Arctic. How we use it, our philosophy is straightforward. It's cautiously assertive. I don't think you find this in 25 years of doing emergency management in the nation. I don't see this a lot. We are cautiously assertive. We'd like to utilize it. We have our checks and balances. We have our protocols, but I think we would use it more than most communities would. We've issued dozens of alerts for everything from Arctic storms to cold and hazardous travels. situational awareness of non-natural events. And what I mean by that is the military doing exercises over either Kaktovik or Point Hope, as an example, scheduled for a weekend, or when something is happening that the community wants to know, we'll coordinate that messaging and can get that out to wireless phones if needed, and specifically if requested by some of the community members and the leadership. Community-wide sheltering notifications and safety guidance. At one point, we actually had an activated shelter and gave out the phone number for coordinating transportation to that shelter when there's a power outage in the midst of winter. Logistics messaging, notifying people about fuel delivery delays and arrivals. And then routine testing. And Stephanie highlighted this, and we really do go into communities. And then before we generally leave a community, we will do a test to their leadership. We will update the list of leaders in the community who would need to be notified, and then we will test that. So we want to make sure that the system works. And the good news is, as geographically isolated as we are, through the cell providing system out there, irrespective of who your provider is, the phones absolutely do get pinged. And so far, our success rate has been around 97+% through our alert and warning protocols. We did one emergency alert, which is the interrupting anything and everything, and it was in coordination and at the request of local law enforcement for the North Slope Borough. We have a really great working relationship with the chief of police, and that was an incident that was happening in Point Hope, and we wanted to send out the message. And the good news is it had full saturation to the impacted community. Everyone knew what was happening. The note that you see there is that even we forgot to notify the local one and only local radio station KBRW, which it interrupts their signal. And the objective there is close that loop so that they know this is going to go out and impact their radio station's broadcast, because they will inevitably be getting phone calls to them as well as a 911 dispatch center if one exists. So by doing this, though, it demonstrated tribal capacity for us to manage high-risk, really time-sensitive incidents. It proved its point, because by all accounts, this would not have gone out under any other authority in the state of Alaska. They would not have seen it as high enough of a priority, but our community did, ICAS did, the borough did, and we just said, let's send it. Now, it wasn't without consequences. We did receive some negative feedback from the communication, not the leadership of the state. They were awesome, but the communications people didn't understand fully that we had the authority that we had with ICAS-DEM to issue those alerts, and one of only 11 tribes in the United States that had the authority. And FEMA, to their credit, that government-to-government relationship, backed us up and said, you absolutely have the authority, clarified to everyone that ICAS-DEM and ICAS as the tribe had that authority to do that. Now, how has it changed everything for us and what we do in DEM? It's made us credible, unquestionably. And it's made us credible not just within Alaska, but I think in the US with FEMA, with DHS. That IPAWS designation and authority really gave us a credibility that we didn't see coming. It's the direct recognition and continued predictable engagement by FEMA. And we know that administrations change. Certainly at the state, we don't know what the relationship with the state will look like under a new governor. We don't know what it would look like theoretically under a president or a new president with FEMA, but FEMA has been consistent in that government-to-government relationship. And even with the current administration, we have really good working relationships with FEMA, and the president has indicated that he intends on continuing that, certainly within FEMA and emergency management. We have legitimacy in emergency management coordination forums. These two photos below, two different summits that we've been participating in. Stephanie on the right at the graduation of the National Emergency Management Advanced Academy with Willie Nunn, the former administrator of FEMA Region 10, and Brian Fisher, as well as Sabrina Gubritz, who is the tribal emergency manager for the Tlingit and Haida. So it's provided us protection against external influence. And that's good, because we're building a system that needs predictability and consistency and continuity, and IPAWS has provided that for us. I want to throw this up as we really do get towards the end, and this is something that you sometimes you just share it for the sake of sharing it. The challenges that we had received regarding alerting and authority. This came from a communications person at the state who was not happy that we had the authority, and had referred to saying that ICAS didn't have the ability to speak for other Alaska tribes or any other Native association, and equated us to just like any other, quote, city or county. Well, clearly that's not right on a lot of levels. So we wanted to share this with you that if this is something that you pursue, you're really going to have to put your proverbial pitchfork in the ground and say, this is our terrain, this is our authority, and we're going to utilize this in the way that we think our tribal governments, in this case plural, need it to be defended. Stephanie, you want to talk about the relationship we have with the borough and the police department?
And that kind of ties into our alerting capabilities and how we fit within our region and being able to have that working relationship with the North Slope Borough Police Department. So we've acknowledged that our ICAS-DEM, we're Arctic-wide IPAWS alerting authority, and the dispatch 911 dispatch capability is housed within the North Slope Borough with their police department. And with those two distinctions of our alerting and the 911 dispatch, we have the clear division of responsibilities and roles and that mutual respect with our local government in coordinating where ICAS is emergency management and EOC coordination, and the North Slope Borough leads that powerful operations section. And that's the distinction. And that's a working, ongoing relationship as we continue to work with our North Slope Borough. And the model of this, of cooperation while simultaneously promoting but not sacrificing tribal sovereignty as we keep in mind and moving forward of what's tribal emergency management, especially communicating that with our member tribes in each of the communities. The next one, John. So tying it all in, why this matters, why this alerting model matters. One, having Alaska and only tribal IPAWS authority being able to cover the Arctic and throughout our region, and being able to, when our tribal leaderships in our communities are requesting us to send something in regards to life, health, safety impacts within our tribal citizens and our community, being able to have that message sent out and having our local government, our public works, and our key stakeholders in the loop of those kind of messages before they go out as well, with that working relationship that we have. And then the direct relevance to the Arctic of where we're at, to the Arctic security and the international borders, and then the scalable model for other tribal emergency management programs. John, do you want to touch on that?
I do a little bit, just very briefly, and that is that even though we are, quote, emergency management, the Department of Emergency Management, within our scope is the phrase and the word and the policy of Homeland Security. So in so many ways, ICAS-DEM is more like an ICAS Homeland Security and Emergency Management model. We've not built the Homeland Security part, but what is abundantly clear is that there are Homeland Security, not Homeland Defense issues, but Department of Homeland Security-like issues up north as we see the changing Arctic, the presence of outside influences, everything from China, Russia to tour boats coming through. And those are areas that are still very gray and are in the process of being developed. But it's one that DEM, for our DEM up north, will have a very substantial role in that. And then Stephanie?
The next one.
Yep. You see it?
Yes, some key takeaways for our listeners and for tribal emergency management professionals. The coordination, collaboration, and communication is key in developing tribal emergency management in rural and geographically isolated communities. And the credibility follows as demonstrated capabilities. IPAWS is a sovereignty tool, not just technology, wanting to emphasize that. And then federal recognition of tribal emergency management can shift local and state dynamics. And then lastly, tribal-led alert and warning saves lives, protects and preserves culture, heritage, and tradition in isolated communities. And then the last one,
There you go.
Koyanak, for having
Thank
us
you.
here. And we
Yep.
provided our email addresses, the website. John, I don't know if you shared that one, the
It went
last
right at the
slide.
end. I do not want to share again. We'll figure
Oh,
it out.
okay. Okay, no problem. So we'll open it up now, I think, Lori, to questions, or I'll turn it over to you.
Yep, that sounds good. Thank you so much. Yeah, are there any questions from people in the audience? Feel free to come off mute and ask or type them in the chat.
See a lot of familiar
This
names and
is
faces.
Yep,
This
and
is
this is
Lisa.
Mary, and let me jump in. This is Mary, and I don't have a question. I just want to say thank you. The model that you have created there on the North Slope is one that's replicable with a great deal of work, but it's replicable in other tribal communities, certainly, but also in rural communities. So thank you for what you've done.
Thank you, Marion. It's good to see you.
Absolutely.
You.
While we're waiting for another question, I'll tell you we're tired. So Stephanie and I have been doing this together, and it's been an absolute privilege. But this is the 5th year, and it has been nonstop. And it's one thing to build it's one thing to build an emergency management function, department, or whatever you want to call it, within one specific domain or jurisdiction. But when you build it across this large geographic swath with all of those government entities and try to pull them together, one of the good conversations Stephanie and I had way back was, this is going to take some time. We're not going to build it overnight. It won't take us a year. And here we are 5 years in, and we're making great progress, but it's still going to take a while.
This is Mary, and I do have another question. You're talking about what you've done up on the slope. Is there a similar model, a similar program? And I'm thinking specifically of Southeast Alaska and all of the number of different isolated communities that are there. Or are you the first in the neighborhood to do this?
I think when I know Tlingit and Haida, the other regional tribe in Alaska, um, I'm not sure when I think we were simultaneously developing emergency management, and not to speak on their behalf, but I think in our beginning of our years of from program to implementing it to a department, I think there was a lot of outreach of because it was a big question of what is tribal emergency management, and I think
Right.
there was a lot of leaning off of different like Tlingit and Haida and other tribes in the lower 48 and trying to build out those networks to see how it would fit because it was new.
Mm-hmm.
And Mary, to build upon that, Stephanie, what Stephanie just shared, we work pretty closely with the Tlingit and Haida, with Sabrina and Jason Wilson and
With
their
Sabrina.
coordinators. The two departments are the two regional tribal emergency management systems in the state of Alaska right now as two federally recognized regional tribal governments. But there are similarities and differences between constitutions and the way that we operate. So I think ours is a little more, I want to say a little more hands-on-ish. But we worked together. And in fact, one of the things that Stephanie and I did, we went down at the request of Tlingit and Haida to facilitate after action for the glacier outflow flood event that just occurred that the Tlingit and Haida facilitated. And then we're trying to develop almost like a tribal EMAC reciprocity, regional tribe
Right.
to regional tribe as well, and then build that system internally to Alaska. So good steps, great vision. It's just going to take some hard work.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, uh, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yep,
absolutely.
we can hear you.
Oh, hey, yeah, my name is Francis Cipri, and I'm from Tuxet Bay, southwest coast. And, we were hit by Typhoon Halong this past October. but not to the extent of Quigilnock, Kipnik, and Nightmare. But we did suffer some damage, and tribal emergency management preparing. So, did you guys ever address how your subsistence way of life with I know it's all impacted because from Quigilnock all the way to Tuxub Bay, that's like I'll say about 150 miles of coastline that got tore up pretty good, and it's going to affect um, subsistence gathering when it's time to do so. It definitely will, because we're gonna have to spend so much amount of dollars to gather what we need for the winter. And that's something that kind of really stressed me out after it happened, because it was chaotic for me. Um, you had organizations come out all of a sudden, one right after the other. And it was very strange because I've never seen that before, especially after something happened that, what's going on. But anyway, so addressing our lifestyle, uh, how did how did you manage about going about that to prepare for that? And because I myself been thinking about this a whole lot lately, especially being prepared for what's to come. I mean, what do I need to do? What am I trying to do, or what am I trying to say has been going through my head late, as of late, because it's going to affect a lot of people, especially when that time comes. So, yeah, how did you guys address that? Or how did people of the North Slope address that? If they had, um, if anything, so to speak.
Yeah. Stephanie, you
Thank you for that, Francis, and thank you for sharing. I think on our side, it's an ongoing effort. There, I know our communities, they were different, but we're the same. And I know one of our working partners, they have a the North Slope Board, they have a wildlife department that monitors and oversees, and there's communication through. And I know through one of our processes through the mitigation plan, we were trying to implement and capture where I know when I went through the old hazard mitigation plan of there's a snow berm, there's a something of a project like that, and we were able to open the dialogue to our ice cellars being a critical component and trying to find avenues in that aspect to try to put pre-planning in place. And I know that we're still working on our efforts. Like I just was writing down what you were mentioning. Um, like what am I trying to do, and then what am I trying to say, and those components of subsistence being affected. And I think those are ongoing conversations that we're having with our communities. John, did you want to add on?
Yeah, Stephanie, I do. Francis, thanks. Tuxuk Bay, I'm intimately familiar. In fact, Teresa Arafak John, she's one of my mentors and good friends, and I will share with you that what Stephanie said has been really important, and that is including those culturally important and culturally important items, issues, your heritage sites, subsistence camps, ice cellars in something that is documented like a hazard mitigation plan. We naturally, in tribal communities, we don't want to sometimes capture where they are, document them formally because we don't want to share those things. But one of the things that we learned from Typhoon Halong was in Quig and Kipnuk, as an example, they may have to move, as an example. They may have to relocate permanently. And because that discussion or a plan about where they might move was not in a hazard mitigation plan, it wasn't permanently documented, it wasn't identified. Everybody just kind of knew it, but because it wasn't documented, FEMA came back to them and said, we can't fund this through FEMA. It'll have to be similar to what we saw in a lot of ways with Newtok to Matavik, which is just a piecemeal over 20 years. It's going to be a problem again. So I think what we would encourage is if you have a hazard mitigation plan, to first try to do one, either with other communities, part of a region, or on your own, and then identify those critical pieces of critical infrastructure. When we say critical infrastructure, we tend to think of like a water line or a sewer line or power, and that's great, absolutely. Physical critical infrastructure, where it exists, list it. But what is cultural infrastructure that is critical to the community? And if you look at the North Slope Borough ICAS Hazard Mitigation Plan, one section identifies what the North Slope Borough identifies as physical infrastructure, then the community identifies each one, what is critical to them. And sometimes it's like the Presbyterian Church. It's the ice cellar. It's a little tiny store. But you know what? That matters to the community. We incorporate it. That way we can show it to FEMA if we need to utilize it as critical for that specific community. And so far, it's working.
And one thing to add on with John mentioned, the more we're able to have conversations with our community of concerns in their areas, we're opening to dialogue, because a concern of we had a conversation in one of our communities, Inupiat Pass, when there was wildland fire, and some of our concerns, we might not know how to navigate where to go to or how to get it addressed, or where does it fall within, oh, that's like tribal emergency management, or how we're able to assist and further advocate. And the comment from one of the elders in Inupiat Pass was wildland fire coming in, and it was coming too close to Inupiat, and they were afraid of the migration of the caribou getting affected because the lichen was getting destroyed. And so that was something that we noted of how we're able to put something in place, or how we're able to further advocate for any further response in that area. So we have that kind of highlighted of something that we need to look out for. But that kind of helped change our dynamic in regards to opening dialogue within our community and having how we're able to kind of address whether those concerns and figuring an avenue to kind of put it all together. I hope it's a long-winded response from John and I, Francis, but I hope that helps.
It's, at least it's giving me something to think about. And sorry to cut this short. I got to go get my baby from Head Start. So I guess I'll be talking to some of you anytime soon then.
Kuyana.
Thank you.
We have about a minute left, and I do see that Krista put in the chat, can you speak to training opportunities for emergency management that you are aware of?
Oh, unquestionably. I mean, the state, the partnership with the state has a really good. You have to basically reach out to the state. Jeff McKenzie is the state training officer, and just say point blank, "Here's what I would like." Now that could be for tribal, non-tribal communities. For FEMA, if you want to do a tribal only particular training, go right to FEMA Region 10. Say the same thing. I would like to do this particular training. We always try to base it first with Incident Command System 1 and 200. As much as I didn't like it in the past, it is a common denominator across the board. So generally start with that, the role of emergency management. And then where Stephanie and I are now with ICAS is very specific position training across the communities. But I would say State Training Officer Jeff McKenzie, and then FEMA Region 10. And Mary, I was gonna your comment about the definition of disaster and subsistence. The state of Alaska is really good at recognizing. Now, there's a lot of this is a big comment here, but after disasters, they will cover subsistence cabins where FEMA can't. The policy's changed, but I think after 20 years, the federal government, at least currently with FEMA, is starting to understand that. As an example, subsistence cabins in Alaska communities, rural, isolated communities, they're not like second homes on the coast of New Jersey. And that's what
Right.
drove those policies. Their view was, oh, you got a vacation cabin on the coast. No, this is part of the culture, the identity. And after Typhoon Morbach, they did make an attempt at really changing that. And until it gets fully implemented, the state of Alaska comes in and fills the gap. So we're getting there. We just have to be persistent, vocal, capital letters on sovereignty and self-determination, the role of subsistence, and why it's not one single culture, multiple cultures. And that Alaska is just not a single reservation, right? It's not.
Right.
So we have to explain that to the federal government, but I think they're starting to get the message, certainly at FEMA Region 10.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, thank you
Thank
so
you.
much for your presentation and bringing your expertise. And the recording of this will be up on our website shortly. And yeah, I appreciate your knowledge on the subject. And I hope everybody has a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Lori, and
Thanks.
your team.
Thank you.